let's talk about your feelings on closed source versus open source more generally. So, um, some uh, some of the providers of these big LLMs are increasingly closed source. So, one of the most cutting digs for OpenAI is to call them closed. For OpenAI is to call them closed AI. Um, so, they were set up with this mission of open sourcing AGI, and now with GPT-4, their technical paper on it doesn't provide any details about the model, whereas at least the GPT-3 paper a couple of years ago did. So, yeah, what are these kinds of trade-offs? What's your perspective on it? Should are there some things that tech companies should be keeping closed source to remain competitive, or does this stifle innovation? Are there security implications? I imagine there's a lot of ways and a lot of thoughts, a lot of ways that you could go on this, a lot of thoughts that you have.
Absolutely. Very, very good question. It's something that we've been debating a lot in our own lab. We recently had a retreat with companies and we spent the whole panel just arguing about open source versus closed source. And my colleagues are pretty divided, I would say. I think I'm somewhere in the middle in the sense that I think that proprietary LLM models are still going to be extremely, extremely good just because it takes a lot of money and resources to do that all the data collection, to have access to data, to train an LLM process. So I think why isn't Google, for example, search open source, right? And so I think there's still going to be, I think the proprietary ones are still going to have some advantage, but I also think that open source LLMs are going to become, especially foundational models, are going to become very, very good. Also, there's some thought on whether the government is going to step in and want to help with open sourcing um, quality LLM models, just because there's more control then, right? And there's just more transparency about what's going on. It just comes back to trust and confidence, because we all know that these LLMs can have a significant impact on society if they're not, conducted with care. Um, the other aspect that I think it's interesting is that I think there's going to be not necessarily one LLM provider to cover them all. I think there's so many domains of knowledge and of expertise. For example, I know there could be a really good one in that tech, could be one in a certain kind of insurance, right? So I think there's going to be companies coming up that will be specialized at a domain, and they'll fine tune the LLM, the foundational LLM that's probably an open source LLM, and fine tune it for that domain of expertise so good. And they'll have access to confidential data for that domain. And that will make their LLMs extremely good. And I think that's there's a place for proprietary LMs there and like very domain specific. And I think they'll be better than a general LM provider will be at that specific task. They won't cover all the other tasks, but they'll be better at that specific tasks. So I think there will be some sort of decentralization of this LLM providers based on tasks and based on domain.
Yeah, I think I'm 100% in the same boat as you, Raluca. I see the same thing happening. There's too many groups out there, like at Berkeley, working on Vicuña and open sourcing that. There are too many clever people all over the world coming up with ways of being able to, especially as you say, for these domain-specific use cases, having smaller models, with 3 billion or 7 billion parameters, can run on a single GPU that can be quantized and run on a CPU very cheaply, very quickly, that tackle these specific tasks, and provided that the creator has maybe some proprietary data that they have from their niche that they've collected from lots of users, they can create a model that's better than the big proprietary ones from Anthropic, OpenAI, whatever.
Yeah. And I mean, speaking of open source from versus proprietary from the perspective of security and privacy, there is a clear advantage of open source there, right? You can take an open source model and run it in your on-prem, right? And you can send queries to that model that are proprietary. and no problem, right? It runs in on-prem. It's not like you're sending those queries to a remote LLM provider that can see now organization data, code from your organization. So there's a clear advantage of open source models over proprietary ones when it comes to privacy and confidentiality. There is, though, I think, another challenge when it comes to privacy and confidentiality, and this is something hard to address even when you have an open source model that runs on-prem. So you train, let's say this open source model is fine-tuned over your organization data, right? But then what if Alice asks a question like, what's the salary of the CEO? So now if this LLM model is trained over the whole organization data, now the thing is that even in an organization, there's pockets of knowledge, right? There's access control, there's walls of information flow. And how can we teach an LLM model to respect those walls? And that's really challenging. I mean, you can tell them, hey, don't provide financial information to Alice or not, but you probably can't exhaust all those possibilities, and probably somehow indirect queries could reveal. So that's, I would say, a very challenging question with open source or proprietary. So how do they keep track of these information walls?
Yeah, a year ago, a really trendy term for describing solutions to this problem prior to LLMs kicking off, prior to ChatGPT's release, there was a lot of talk about this idea of a data mesh. And so we had Zhamak Dehghani in episode number 609 of this show. She coined the term data mesh and wrote the O'Reilly book on the topic. And so, yeah, it was a fascinating technical deep dive into these kinds of problems around when you have an organization, the HR people, they need to know this CEO salary. They need to be able to pay the CEO's paycheck every month. But of course, that isn't necessarily going to be information that everyone in the company should have. And so it's interesting, these um, even so with that data mesh concept, there was this idea of having data distributed across different departments, and you have rules as to who can get access to what. But with LLMs, as you're alluding to, this is really hard because there's no longer these strict boundaries. It's just
Exactly.
model weights distributed across the whole model.
Exactly. They combine, and exactly the weights are affected by really all the information. And we know, in security and cryptography that sometimes you can reveal information indirectly. For example, if I know that Alice leaves for work every day at, 8 a.m. and whatnot, then um, I can infer the fact that, okay, if she's living at home, then she's going for work, right? Or something like this. So it's indirect knowledge that um, you can infer, yeah, even without asking a question directly. So how do you kind of prevent that?
Yeah. So at this point, I guess that's just a question. There's no
Exactly, it's a
yeah, yeah.
research question. Of course, there's some attempts. I've seen NVIDIA guardrails have some interesting proposal. There's some attempts at teaching the LLM to, respect some rules, but it's not going to be precise. There's going to be ways to get around that.